The billionaire offered her $1 million and a cruel deal. Have my child. I'll erase your father's debt. Then you walk away. She was desperate, drowning in bills, watching her mother die slowly. So she said yes. She sold her body to a billionaire who believed love was a transaction and emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated. A beautiful story for my most amazing and loving family. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to my channel. I just want to take a moment to thank every one of you who keeps coming back to watch, comment, and share these stories. Your love truly keeps this channel alive. And to all our new subscribers, welcome to the family. You're not just viewers here, you're part of something special. Before we dive into today's emotional story, let's pray. May peace fill your heart. May love find you wherever you are. And may every tear you've cried turn into joy. If you believe it, comment amen. And don't forget to subscribe and share this story to bless someone else. Also, tell me where and what time you're watching from. I love knowing how far our channel family reaches. Now, my beautiful family, let's dive into the story. Make sure you watch till the end. Isabella Hart stood outside the Blackwell Tower with trembling hands and a letter from the bank that felt heavier than her father's coffin. 3 weeks ago, she had buried the man who raised her, the man who worked himself to exhaustion in Ethan Blackwell's corporate machine. And now the debt collectors were circling like vultures, threatening to take her mother's home, her father's memory, everything she had left. Her father's sudden heart attack had left behind more than grief. It had left behind crushing debt, medical bills stacked like accusations, and a daughter who had no idea how deep the hole truly went. She had spent every night since his funeral answering calls from men with cold voices who spoke about repossession and legal action, as if her pain meant nothing. And now she was here, standing before the man who owned half the city, praying he would remember her father's 20 years of loyal service. But men like Ethan Blackwell didn't trade in mercy. They traded in power. The receptionist barely looked at her as she signed in, and the elevator ride to the top floor felt like ascending to judgment. Isabella's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who had aged 5 years in 3 weeks, dark circles under her eyes, a cheap blazer she had borrowed from friend, and desperation clinging to her like perfume. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world of marble and silence, where every surface gleamed with wealth she could never touch. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Blackwell behind a desk made of black glass, his eyes as cold as the contract he signed. He didn't stand when she entered. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's deciding whether to solve or ignore. "Miss Hart," he said, her name sounding like an afterthought. "You have 5 minutes." Isabella's voice cracked when she spoke, but she forced the words out anyway. "Mr. Blackwell, my father worked for you for 20 years. He gave everything to your company. And when he died, he left behind debts I can't pay. I'm asking you, begging you, to give me time, a payment plan, anything. My mother is sick, and they're going to take our home." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her with the detached curiosity of a man examining something beneath him. "Your father was a loyal employee," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "But loyalty doesn't erase debt. Business is business, Miss Hart. Sentiment doesn't pay bills." The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, Isabella wondered if he had ever felt anything at all, if there was anything human left behind those calculating eyes. She opened her mouth to plead again, but he raised a hand, silencing her with the casual authority of a king dismissing a servant. "However," he continued, and something shifted in his expression, something dark and deliberate, "I'm not without options. I have a proposition for you." Isabella's heart pounded in her chest, hope and dread tangling together. "What kind of proposition?" Ethan stood, walking around his desk with the slow precision of a predator circling prey. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his cold blue eyes, close enough that she could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on her like gravity. "I need a child," he said, his voice calm, businesslike, as if he were discussing a merger. "An heir. But I have no interest in the complications of marriage or the messiness of emotion. You need your debt erased, and I need a solution that doesn't disrupt my life." So here's the deal. You carry my child, give birth. And once the child is born, your debt disappears. You'll be compensated, of course. Generously. Isabella's mind went blank, her breath catching in her throat as the full weight of his words sank in. He wasn't offering her a job or a loan. He was offering to buy her body, her future, as if she were nothing more than a vessel for his ambition. Disgust churned in her stomach, but so did something else, something darker. The suffocating realization that she had no other choice. Her mother's medication cost more than she made in a month. The eviction notice was already taped to their door, and every other path she had tried had led to a dead end. Could a woman really sell her dignity to save the people she loved, or was there a price too high even for survival? You can't be serious, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm always serious, Ethan replied, returning to his desk as if the conversation were already over. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, the offer expires. And so does any chance you have of saving your mother's home. Isabella stood frozen, her mind screaming at her to run, to tell him to go to hell, but her legs wouldn't move. She thought of her mother's frail hands, the way she smiled even through the pain, the way she whispered her late husband's name in her sleep. She thought of the creditors who had already started seizing her father's belongings, the landlord who had stopped returning her calls, and the suffocating weight of a world that didn't care if she drowned. Ethan Blackwell was offering her a lifeline, but it was wrapped in chains. I need time to think, she said, her voice hollow. You have 24 hours, he repeated, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Isabella turned and walked toward the elevator, each step feeling like a betrayal of herself. And when the doors closed behind her, she pressed her forehead against the cold steel and let the tears come. But even as she cried, she knew the decision was already made. There was no other way out. 24 hours later, she returned. Ethan didn't ask if she had considered his offer. He simply looked at her with the smug certainty of a man who always got what he wanted. I'll do it, Isabella said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Ethan's lips curled into a cold, satisfied smirk. Good, he said, standing and buttoning his suit jacket with the casual arrogance of a man who had just won a negotiation. Then our deal begins tonight. And in that moment, Isabella realized she had just sold her soul to a man who didn't believe souls existed. Isabella had imagined many things when she agreed to Ethan's deal, but she had never imagined silence could feel like a prison. The mansion he brought her to was a monument to wealth and emptiness. All marble hallways and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in light but no warmth. And from the moment she stepped through the front doors with a single suitcase containing everything she owned, she understood that this place was not a home. It was a mausoleum for the living. Ethan had handed her a typed list of rules before she even unpacked. No touching, no emotions, no questions about his past or his life, and she was to remain in the East Wing unless summoned. He delivered these instructions with the cold efficiency of a man outlining terms to an employee, and Isabella realized with a sinking heart that she was not a guest here. She was a transaction waiting to be fulfilled. The first dinner was the worst. Isabella sat at one end of a table long enough to seat 20, and Ethan sat at the other, an ocean of polished wood stretching between them. The staff served courses in silence, their eyes carefully averted, and the only sound was the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Isabella tried once to speak, to ask him about his day, anything to shatter the suffocating quiet, but he had looked up from his plate with such cold indifference that the words died in her throat. This isn't a marriage, Miss Hart, he said, his voice flat. Don't mistake it for one. And so she learned to eat in silence, to swallow her food along with her dignity, and to wonder if this was what it felt like to slowly disappear. The days blurred together in a monotonous rhythm of isolation. Isabella woke alone, ate alone, and spent her afternoons wandering the mansion's empty rooms like a ghost haunting her own life. Ethan was rarely there, consumed by his empire, and when he did return, he retreated to his study without a word. The only human contact she had were the businesslike visits from Dr. Calloway, a stern woman who checked her vitals, confirmed the pregnancy, and left without ever meeting her eyes. Isabella felt herself shrinking in this place, her voice growing quieter, her presence fading into the background like wallpaper no one noticed. How long could a person survive in luxury that felt like solitary confinement? At night, when the mansion settled into its eerie stillness, Isabella would sit by the window in her room and write in the journal she had brought from home. She wrote about her father, about the way he used to hum while making breakfast, about her mother's laughter before illness stole her strength, about the life she had lost to save the people she loved. The pen felt like her last connection to the woman she used to be, the woman who had dreams and hopes and a future that didn't involve being a stranger in a billionaire's cage. Some nights she cried as she wrote, her tears smudging the ink, and other nights she simply stared at the blank page, wondering if there was anything left inside her worth putting into words. But if Isabella's prison was visible, Ethan's was hidden behind walls he had spent a lifetime building. Late one night, unable to sleep, Isabella ventured downstairs for water and noticed a sliver of light beneath the study door. She shouldn't have stopped. The rules were clear, but something about the stillness pulled her closer, and through the crack in the door, she saw him. Ethan sat alone in the dim glow of a desk lamp, his tie loosened, his usually immaculate appearance unraveling at the edges, and in his hands, he held a photograph. Isabella couldn't see the image clearly, but she could see his face, and for the first time since she met him, she saw something other than cold calculation. She saw pain. Raw, unguarded, devastating pain. Ethan stared at the photograph as if it held answers to questions he couldn't voice, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something that looked like grief. His thumb traced the edge of the frame with a tenderness that seemed impossible from a man who had reduced her life to a contract. And then he whispered, so quietly Isabella almost didn't hear it, "Love destroys empires." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Isabella realized with a jolt that she wasn't the only prisoner in this mansion. Ethan Blackwell had built his fortress to keep the world out, but what if he had also locked himself inside? She stepped back before he could see her, her heart pounding with a confusion she didn't want to feel. It would be easier to hate him if he remained a monster, if he stayed the cold, heartless billionaire who treated her like property. But that glimpse of vulnerability, that whisper of pain, complicated everything. Who had hurt him so deeply that he had sworn off love entirely. And why did a part of her, the part she desperately wanted to silence, suddenly want to understand? The next morning, Ethan was back to his usual coldness, barely acknowledging her at breakfast, and Isabella wondered if she had imagined the broken man in the study. But she hadn't. She had seen the crack in his armor, and now she couldn't unsee it. As she sat across from him in their ocean of silence, she realized something terrifying. She was starting to wonder if the man who had bought her freedom was a villain or a victim. And in a story where she was supposed to be the prisoner, why did he suddenly feel like one too? That night, as Isabella wrote in her journal, she paused and stared at the words she had just written. "I think he's as trapped as I am." She closed the book quickly, as if the thought itself were dangerous, but it was too late. Curiosity had taken root, and in the cold, empty mansion where two strangers lived under the same roof, but in separate worlds, something had shifted. Isabella no longer saw just her captor. She saw a mystery, and despite everything, she wanted to solve it. Isabella had been feeling the dizziness for days, but she had learned to hide discomfort the way she had learned to hide everything else in this mansion, quietly, invisibly, without burdening the man who had made it clear she was nothing more than a means to an end. The pregnancy was taking its toll, the nausea that lasted all day, the exhaustion that clung to her bones, the way her body felt like it belonged to someone else. But she swallowed it all down because complaining meant being seen, and being seen meant risking the fragile distance that kept her heart safe. But the body has its own language, and on a Tuesday morning, while descending the grand staircase, Isabella's vision blurred at the edges. The world tilted sideways, and the last thing she remembered was the cold marble floor rushing up to meet her. She didn't hear Ethan's shout, didn't feel his hands catching her before she hit the ground, didn't see the way his face drained of color as he pressed his fingers to her neck searching for a pulse. But Ethan felt everything. The weight of her collapsing in his arms, the terror that shot through his chest like a bullet, the way his hands trembled as he lifted her with a gentleness he didn't know he still possessed. For a man who prided himself on control, panic was a foreign enemy. But it consumed him entirely as he barked orders at his driver, cradled Isabella's unconscious body against his chest, and felt something crack inside the fortress he had built around his heart. She was just a contract, just a transaction, just a woman carrying his heir. So why the thought of losing her feel like the ground splitting open beneath his feet? The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and urgent voices. Doctors asking questions Ethan couldn't answer because he realized with shame that he knew nothing about her. Not her medical history, not her fears, not even her favorite color. He had reduced her to a clause in an agreement, and now she was lying in a hospital bed pale and fragile, and all his money, all his power, couldn't do anything but wait. So he waited. He sat in the chair beside her bed, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened, his carefully constructed mask crumbling with every minute that passed. The doctor had said she was dehydrated, exhausted, pushed too far by stress and isolation, and Ethan heard the unspoken accusation in those words. This was his fault. When Isabella's eyes finally fluttered open, the first thing she saw was him. Ethan sat hunched in the chair beside her, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands, and he looked nothing like the untouchable billionaire who had bought her dignity. He looked human, tired, haunted. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and the small sound she made brought his head up instantly, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath all over again. "You're awake," he said, and his voice was rough, scraped raw by hours of silence and worry. "What happened?" Isabella whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach, fear flooding through her. "You collapsed," Ethan said, standing and moving closer, but still keeping that careful distance, as if afraid to break whatever fragile thing existed between them. "The baby is fine. But you're not. The doctor said you're exhausted, that you've been under too much stress." He paused, his jaw clenching, and for a moment she thought he would retreat back into coldness, back into the safe role of distant employer. But instead, he did something that shattered every assumption she had made about him. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes, and whispered, "Don't ever scare me like that again." The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and raw, and Isabella felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the voice of a man protecting an investment. This was the voice of someone who had been genuinely afraid, and the realization struck her like lightning. Could a man who claimed to feel nothing actually care? And if he could care even just a little, what did that mean for the walls she had built around her own heart? "I didn't mean to," she said softly, and for the first time since they met, she saw him not as her captor, but as something more complicated, something broken, trying desperately not to break further. Ethan finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw exhaustion and something else, something he was fighting hard to suppress. "You need rest," he said, his voice steadier now, the mask trying to reassemble itself. "I've arranged for round-the-clock care. A nutritionist, a personal nurse, whatever you need." "I don't need staff," Isabella said quietly. "I just need to not feel so alone." The words hit him like a punch, and she watched him flinch, watched the guilt flash across his face before he could hide it. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, and Isabella realized he didn't know how to answer, because admitting she was lonely meant admitting he had made her that way. Instead, he reached out slowly, hesitantly, and did something that stunned them both. He placed his hand over hers where it rested on the hospital bed, his touch warm and careful, as if she were something precious that might shatter. "Then you won't be," he said, and though his voice was quiet, there was a promise buried in those 4 words that neither of them fully understood yet. They stayed like that for a long moment, his hand covering hers, neither of them speaking, and Isabella felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. Hope. It was foolish and reckless and probably destined to destroy her, but she couldn't stop it. She had seen behind his armor twice now, once in his study, and now here in this sterile hospital room, and each glimpse revealed a man at war with himself, a man who had convinced himself that feeling nothing was the only way to survive. But what if he was wrong? What if beneath all that ice, there was still something capable of warmth? When Ethan finally pulled his hand away, the absence of his touch felt like a loss, and Isabella knew with frightening clarity that something had changed between them. The contract was still there, the rules still existed, but a crack had appeared in the foundation of their arrangement, and through that crack, something achingly human had begun to seep through. As Ethan helped her back to the car later that evening, his hand steadying her elbow with unexpected gentleness, Isabella caught herself thinking the most dangerous thought of all. Maybe, just maybe, the man who had bought her wasn't as unreachable as he wanted everyone to believe. And in the quiet of the car ride home, as Ethan stared out the window pretending not to notice how close he was sitting to her, he thought the same terrifying thought. Maybe this woman he had tried so hard to keep at arm's length had already found her way past every defense he owned. After the hospital, something unspoken shifted in the mansion's atmosphere, as if the walls themselves had exhaled for the first time in years. Ethan didn't abolish his rules, but he began breaking them in small, almost imperceptible ways, asking Isabella how she slept, lingering an extra moment at breakfast, and on a crisp Saturday morning, doing something that stunned her completely. He asked if she wanted to accompany him somewhere. Isabella, who had spent weeks as a ghost in his home, could only stare at him in disbelief before nodding, afraid that speaking might shatter whatever fragile truce they had stumbled into. She didn't ask where they were going. She was simply grateful to leave the mansion's beautiful prison, and as Ethan's car wound through the city streets toward the outskirts of town, she watched him from the corner of her eye and wondered what secrets this day would reveal. The orphanage appeared suddenly, a modest brick building with peeling paint, and a playground where children's laughter rang out like wind chimes. Ethan parked the car, but didn't immediately exit, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if anchoring himself against a storm only he could feel. "My mother used to volunteer here," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the building. Before she left, Isabella held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the moment, because this was the first time Ethan had willingly spoken about the wound that had shaped him into the man who believed love was a transaction. She waited, and after a long silence, he stepped out of the car, and she followed. The children swarmed him the moment he entered, their small hands reaching for the man who visited rarely but always brought gifts, books, toys, donations that kept the lights on and the doors open. Isabella watched as Ethan's carefully constructed coldness melted in the presence of these orphans who asked for nothing but his attention, and she saw something she had never expected: gentleness. He knelt to speak to a little girl with missing front teeth, listened intently to a boy who showed him a drawing, and when he smiled, truly smiled, Isabella felt her heart crack open. This was the man beneath the armor, the man he could have been if love hadn't taught him that caring meant losing. Later, as they sat on a weathered bench watching the children play, Ethan spoke without looking at her, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "My mother used to bring me here when I was young. She'd tell me that love meant giving without expecting anything in return." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Then she met someone who made her feel alive, and she left. Just walked out of my life for a man who promised her passion, adventure, all the things my father couldn't give her. I was 12. Isabella's chest tightened as the pieces of him fell into place, the picture of a boy abandoned for love, who grew into a man determined never to be vulnerable again. "That's why I buy loyalty instead," he continued, finally turning to meet her eyes. "You can't trust what's given freely, but what's bought and paid for, that stays." Isabella looked at this broken man beside her, this billionaire who had built an empire to fill the void his mother left behind, and she felt something she shouldn't feel: compassion. "You can't buy peace, Ethan," she said softly. "You can only feel it." The words hung between them, simple and devastating, and she watched him struggle with them, watched him want to dismiss them, but unable to because somewhere deep inside, he knew she was right. Could a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding feeling actually learn to feel again? Or had he buried that part of himself so deep that no amount of truth could resurrect it? But something was resurrecting, whether Ethan wanted to admit it or not. In the days that followed, the mansion transformed from a mausoleum into something resembling a home. Dinners were no longer silent affairs with an ocean of tables between them. Ethan began sitting closer, asking about her day, sharing stories of his own. Isabella learned that he loved classical music, but only listened to it when he thought no one could hear, that he had once wanted to be an architect, but his father pushed him into business, that he still dreamed sometimes of his mother's perfume and woke up angry at himself for missing someone who had abandoned him. And Ethan learned that Isabella had wanted to be a teacher, that she hummed when she was nervous, that her strength wasn't loud or demanding, but quiet and unshakable, the kind of strength that came from surviving loss after loss without losing herself. Their conversation stretched into hours, punctuated by laughter that surprised them both, and Isabella realized she was seeing the real Ethan Blackwell, not the cold CEO who wielded power like a weapon, but the lonely man who had convinced himself that isolation was safe. Small touches became natural. His hand on her lower back guiding her through doorways, her fingers brushing his when passing the salt, moments of contact that lingered longer than necessary and left both of them wondering what was happening between them. The contract was still there, the baby growing inside her a constant reminder of the transaction that had brought them together, but the lines were blurring, and neither of them seemed willing to redraw them. One evening, after a dinner filled with easy conversation and shared wine, only his, as she couldn't drink, Isabella felt exhaustion pulling at her, the pregnancy demanding rest. She stood to go to her room, but Ethan stood too, and without a word, he walked with her up the stairs. At her door, she expected him to leave, to retreat back into his study and the safety of distance. But instead, he followed her inside. "You should rest," he said, but he didn't leave. Isabella sat on the edge of the bed, confused and captivated, and watched as Ethan did something that stole her breath. He picked up the brush from her nightstand, sat beside her, and gently began brushing her hair. The intimacy of the gesture was overwhelming. His fingers worked through the strands with unexpected tenderness, and Isabella closed her eyes, feeling tears threatening because this moment, this simple, beautiful moment, felt more real than anything in her life. When he finished, he set the brush down and helped her settle under the covers, tucking the blanket around her with the care of someone protecting something precious. He looked down at her, his expression conflicted, tortured, as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether to jump or turn back. "Good night, Isabella," he whispered, using her first name for the first time, and the sound of it in his voice made her heart race. "Good night, Ethan," she whispered back, and as he left the room, she knew with terrifying certainty that they had crossed a line neither of them could uncross, and the man who had bought her was falling just as hard as she was falling for him. Isabella had spent 9 months preparing for the moment her body would bring new life into the world, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw intensity of labor, the way pain and purpose merged until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Ethan never left her side through those endless hours, his hand gripping hers as if letting go meant losing her, his carefully constructed composure shattering with every contraction that made her cry out. He whispered encouragement he didn't know he possessed, wiped her forehead with trembling hands, and when the doctors finally placed a tiny, wailing baby boy into Isabella's arms, Ethan's world stopped turning. The child was impossibly small, with dark hair and eyes that hadn't yet decided what color they would become, and as Isabella cradled him against her chest, tears streaming down her exhausted face, she looked up at Ethan and saw something that changed everything. He was crying too. Ethan Blackwell, the man who had bought her body to carry his heir, the billionaire who had built fortresses around his heart, stood frozen in the delivery room with tears sliding down his face, and when the nurse asked if he wanted to hold his son, he nodded wordlessly, his hands shaking as he accepted the fragile bundle. The moment the baby settled against his chest, something ancient and primal awakened in Ethan, something he had spent his entire life running from. Love without conditions, without contracts, without escape. He looked down at this tiny human who shared his DNA but had done nothing to earn his affection except to exist, and then he looked at Isabella, pale and beautiful and utterly exhausted, and the truth hit him like a tidal wave. She had given him more than an heir. She had given him a family, a purpose, a reason to be more than the cold machine he had forced himself to become. "You've given me more than I ever deserved," he whispered, his voice breaking, and Isabella saw in his eyes that he wasn't talking about the baby. He was talking about everything. The laughter over dinner, the quiet conversations, the way she had seen through his armor and refused to let him hide, the way she had transformed his mausoleum into a home simply by existing in it. In that hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the soft cries of their newborn son, Isabella watched Ethan fall completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love, and she realized with a joy so fierce it hurt that she had fallen too. They named him Alexander, and he brought light into spaces that had only known shadows. The mansion that had once echoed with emptiness now filled with the sounds of life, a baby's cries in the middle of the night, lullabies humming at dawn, laughter that felt like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Ethan, who had once disappeared into his office for 18-hour workdays, began ignoring calls from aboard, canceling meetings, and arriving home early with toys and books and a softness in his eyes that his employees wouldn't have recognized. He would spend hours simply watching Alexander sleep, his large hand resting gently on the baby's tiny chest, counting heartbeats, as if they were miracles. And Isabella would watch him from the doorway and feel her heart expand beyond what she thought possible. Their days melted into a rhythm of domestic bliss that felt surreal in its simplicity. Ethan learned to change diapers with the same precision he applied to billion-dollar deals, and Isabella taught him how to hold Alexander during feedings, their hands touching as they passed the bottle between them, their eyes meeting over their son's head with understanding that needed no words. They cooked together, laughed over burnt pancakes, danced in the kitchen with Alexander between them, and in those stolen moments of normalcy, the contract that had brought them together felt like a lifetime ago, a dark beginning to a story that had somehow found its way to light. One evening, after they had put Alexander to bed and the mansion settled into peaceful quiet, Isabella found Ethan standing by the nursery window, staring out at the city lights with an expression she couldn't quite read. She moved to his side, and without thinking, he wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close in a gesture that had become natural, necessary, as essential as breathing. "I never thought I could have this," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "I spent so long believing that love was a weakness, that caring meant losing, that the only way to survive was to feel nothing." He turned to face her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with devastating tenderness. "But you changed everything, Isabella. You walked into my life as a transaction, and you became the only thing that matters." Isabella's breath caught as tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of this moment, of this man who had started as her captor and had become her home. "You were never part of the contract, Ethan," she whispered, placing her hand over his heart, feeling it race beneath her palm. "From the moment you held my hand in that hospital room, from the moment you brushed my hair, from every dinner and every laugh and every time you looked at me like I was more than what you bought, you were writing a different story, one I never want to end." "I love you," Ethan said, and the words sounded like a vow, like a prayer, like the most terrifying and liberating thing he had ever admitted. "I love you, and I don't know how to do this, how to be this person, but I want to learn. I want to spend every day proving that you're not a contract. You're my everything." "I love you too," Isabella breathed, and when he kissed her, it wasn't the first time their lips had met, but it was the first time it felt like a promise rather than a question. They stood wrapped in each other's arms, two broken people who had somehow found wholeness in the spaces between their wounds, and for the first time in both their lives, the future looked like something worth believing in. Can two people really rewrite their beginning and build a happily ever after from the ashes of a cruel transaction? In that moment, as Ethan held Isabella close and their son slept peacefully in the next room, the answer felt like yes, love had won, the contract had been burned, and the man who once believed emotions destroyed empires had discovered that the right emotion could rebuild them. The mansion was alive, the silence had been conquered, and Isabella Hart, who had sold her freedom to save her family, had found something she never expected, a love without a price, a man without armor, and a happiness that felt, at last, like home. Happiness, Isabella was learning, was a fragile thing, built on hope and trust, and the belief that the past could stay buried if you simply refused to look back. For 3 months, she and Ethan had existed in a bubble of domestic bliss, their days filled with Alexander's milestones, and their nights filled with whispered conversations and kisses that tasted like promises. The mansion had transformed from a prison into a sanctuary, and Isabella had allowed herself to believe that love had truly conquered the darkness that once lived in Ethan's heart. But she should have known that shadows don't disappear. They simply wait for the right moment to return. And when Ethan's father walked through the front door unannounced on a cold November afternoon, Isabella watched in real time as the man she loved began to disintegrate before her eyes. Richard Blackwell was a monument to old money and older cruelty, a man who wore his disdain for weakness like a badge of honor. He stood in the foyer with the entitled posture of someone who believed the world owed him obedience, his cold eyes sweeping over Isabella with the same dismissive assessment one might give to furniture. "So this is the woman you bought," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. And before Isabella could respond, Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his entire body going rigid with tension. She had never seen him look like this, not angry, but afraid, like a child bracing for a blow he knew was coming. "Father," Ethan said, the words sounding like a curse. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see what's become of my son," Richard replied, walking into the living room as if he owned it, which Isabella remembered with sinking dread. He technically did. The Blackwell fortune had been built by this man's ruthless hands, and Ethan had spent his entire life trying to earn his approval. "I hear you've been playing house, neglecting your empire to change diapers and play the devoted father. How utterly disappointing." The words landed like poison, and Isabella watched Ethan's jaw clench, watched him retreat into the cold mask she thought he had finally discarded. "My family is none of your business," Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Richard smiled the smile of a predator who smelled blood. "Your family," Richard repeated mockingly. "You mean this transaction you've convinced yourself is love?" He turned to Isabella, his gaze cruel and dissecting. "Did he tell you about his mother, dear? How she fell in love and abandoned everything? Her duty, her son, her legacy, all for passion. And where is she now? Dead in a car accident with her lover, having thrown away her life for feelings." He turned back to Ethan, and his voice dropped to something even more venomous. "You're weak, Ethan. Just like her. Ruled by emotion. Building your life on sentiment rather than strategy. You think this woman loves you, but love is just another word for eventual betrayal." Isabella saw Ethan flinch, saw the words hit him exactly where they were designed to hit, and she wanted to scream, to tell Richard to leave, to protect the man she loved from the poison being poured into his ears. But before she could speak, Richard delivered his final blow. "Love ruined your mother," he said, and Isabella watched Ethan's face as the words transported him backward, to a memory he had spent decades trying to bury. "Don't repeat her mistake." The flashback came unbidden, unwanted. A ghost Ethan couldn't exorcise. He was 10 years old, standing in this very mansion, watching his mother pack a suitcase while his father's voice echoed through the halls. "You're destroying this family for what? For a man who makes you feel alive? Feelings fade, Catherine. And then what will you have?" His mother had knelt before him, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "I'm sorry, my darling. I have to follow my heart." And young Ethan, not understanding, had asked, "Don't you love me?" She had kissed his forehead, but she had still left, and 2 years later she was dead, and his father had stood over him at the funeral and said with cold finality, "This is what love does. It destroys everything. Remember that." Ethan blinked, returning to the present, and Isabella saw the damage immediately. The walls were going back up, the armor reassembled piece by piece, and the man who had held her last night and whispered about forever was disappearing behind the billionaire who believed emotions were liabilities. "I think you should leave, Father," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "I'll leave," Richard said, straightening his suit. "But remember what I taught you, son. Control is everything. Lose control, and you lose everything." He walked past Isabella without another glance, and when the door closed behind him, the silence that remained was suffocating. "Ethan," Isabella said softly, reaching for him, but he stepped back, and that small movement shattered her. "I need to work," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I've been neglecting the company. There are deals that need my attention." "Ethan, please," Isabella tried again, fear creeping into her voice. "Don't let him do this. Don't let him take away what we have." But he was already walking toward his study, already retreating into the cold fortress where emotions couldn't reach him. And when he spoke, his voice was the voice of a stranger. What we have is a child, Isabella. Everything else was just a distraction. The words felt like a knife, and Isabella stood frozen in the foyer, holding Alexander against her chest, watching the man she loved disappear into his study and close the door. How quickly could a person undo months of healing with a single conversation? How deep did old wounds have to be to override new love? She wanted to believe that Ethan would come back to himself, that he would remember the promises they made and the life they were building. But as the hours stretched into evening and his study door remained closed, doubt began to poison her hope. That night, Isabella lay alone in bed, Alexander sleeping in his crib beside her, and she listened to the sounds of the mansion, the silence that had once been conquered but was now creeping back like rot. Down the hall, Ethan sat in his study, staring at his mother's photograph, and his father's words echoed in his mind like a curse. Love ruined your mother. Don't repeat her mistake. He looked at the photo, at his mother's smiling face, and for the first time in months, he let the fear win. What if he was making the same mistake? What if loving Isabella meant losing himself, losing his control, losing everything he had built? What if his father was right? The shadow had returned, and it was swallowing him whole, and Isabella, lying awake in the darkness, felt the distance growing between them like a chasm she didn't know how to cross. The happiness they had built was crumbling, and the worst part was watching Ethan choose the fear over her, watching him believe the poison over the truth, and knowing that the man who had finally learned to love was forgetting how in real time. Isabella had tried everything to reach him. Soft words in the morning, gentle touches he no longer returned, questions he answered with silence or cold efficiency. For 2 weeks, she watched Ethan transform back into the man she had met in that glass tower. The billionaire who measured life in transactions and saw emotions as weaknesses to be eliminated. He spent 18-hour days at the office again, came home only to sleep, and when he looked at Alexander, there was love in his eyes, but also something darker. Fear, as if holding his own son might somehow prove his father right. Isabella had tried to be patient, to give him space to work through whatever demons his father had resurrected, but patience was eroding into desperation, and desperation was hardening into something that looked dangerously like anger. How long was a woman supposed to fight for a man who wouldn't fight for himself? The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Ethan returned home at midnight, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched into his face, and found Isabella waiting for him in the living room, Alexander asleep upstairs. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would make him see that running back to his fortress wouldn't protect him. It would only destroy them. But when she saw him, all her carefully planned words dissolved into raw pleading. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, standing from the couch where she had been waiting for hours. "This can't continue. You're shutting me out, shutting us out, and I don't understand why. Your father said terrible things, but they were lies designed to hurt you. Why are you letting him win?" Ethan poured himself a drink, his back to her, and when he finally spoke, his voice was the cold, measured tone of a CEO ending an unsuccessful partnership. "My father didn't lie, Isabella. He reminded me of a truth I had forgotten. Emotions cloud judgment. They make you vulnerable. They make you weak." "Loving someone doesn't make you weak," Isabella said, her voice rising with frustration. "It makes you human. It makes you alive. What we have, what we built together, that's real, Ethan. That's worth protecting." He turned to face her, and the emptiness in his eyes made her heart stop. "What we have is a contract that was fulfilled. You gave me an heir. I erased your debt. The terms were met." The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment Isabella couldn't breathe, couldn't process that the man who had whispered, "I love you" 3 months ago was now reducing everything they had built to a business transaction. "You don't mean that," she whispered, tears already burning in her eyes. "You're scared and you're running, but you don't mean that." "Don't I?" Ethan said, and there was something cruel in his voice now, something that sounded like his father's poison taking root. "You were a solution to a problem, Isabella. I needed an heir without the complications of marriage or emotion, and you needed money. We both got what we wanted. Everything else was just a temporary lapse in judgment. Isabella felt something inside her shatter, felt the last thread of hope snap, and the pain transformed into fury. A lapse in judgment, she repeated, her voice shaking. Is that what you call holding me while I cried? Brushing my hair? Telling me you loved me? Playing with our son, and laughing like you finally understood what it meant to be happy. All of that was just a mistake you're now correcting. Yes, Ethan said, and that single word destroyed her. You're a coward, Isabella said, and she watched him flinch as if she had struck him. Your father spent 5 minutes in this house and convinced you that love was dangerous. And instead of fighting for us, instead of proving him wrong, you're running back to the same lonely existence that was killing you before I walked into your life. You were just a deal, Isabella. Don't make it something it wasn't. She repeated his words back to him, letting them hang in the air like the poison they were. Is that really what you believe? Ethan's jaw clenched, and for a moment she saw him waver, saw the mask slip and the pain beneath it. But then he straightened his shoulders and delivered the final blow. Yes, he said. That's what I believe. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Isabella stood there, tears streaming down her face, staring at the man she loved and realizing with devastating clarity that love wasn't enough. You couldn't save someone who refused to be saved. You couldn't heal someone who chose their wounds over their future. And you couldn't stay with someone who looked you in the eyes and reduced your entire relationship to a transaction. Then I'm leaving, Isabella said, her voice steady despite the tears. I'm taking Alexander, and I'm leaving because I will not raise my son in a house where love is treated like a disease. She turned and walked toward the stairs, and Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything to stop her. Pride and fear held him in place like chains, and he watched her disappear up the staircase, telling himself he was making the right choice, that this was protection, that caring less meant hurting less. But deep down, in a place he refused to acknowledge, he knew he was destroying the only real thing he had ever had. Isabella packed with trembling hands, throwing clothes into a suitcase, while Alexander slept peacefully in his crib, oblivious to the fact that his world was about to be torn in half. She moved mechanically, each item she packed another piece of her heart breaking off and falling away. When she was done, she picked up Alexander, cradled him against her chest, and took one last look at the room that had transformed from a prison to a sanctuary and back to a prison again. On the nightstand sat the ring Ethan had given her 3 months ago, a simple band of platinum with a single diamond that he had slipped onto her finger, while whispering that she deserved more than a contract. Isabella picked it up, held it for a moment, feeling the weight of everything it had represented, and then set it back down. She wouldn't take symbols of a love he claimed never existed. When she walked down the stairs with her suitcase and her son, Ethan was still standing in the living room, his drink untouched in his hand, his eyes fixed on nothing. He looked up as she reached the bottom step, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met. She waited, prayed, despite everything, for him to stop her, to admit he was wrong, to choose them over his fear. But he said nothing. His pride, his father's poison, and his terror of vulnerability kept him frozen. And Isabella realized with soul-crushing finality that the man she loved was already gone. Goodbye, Ethan, she said, and her voice was hollow, emptied of everything but grief. She walked out the front door into the cold night, and Ethan didn't follow. He stood in his mansion surrounded by marble and glass and wealth beyond measure, and for the first time in his life, he understood what his mother must have felt, the suffocating loneliness of having everything and nothing simultaneously. The silence rushed back in like flood water, filling every corner, and Ethan looked down at his hands and saw them shaking. He walked slowly up to the nursery, pushed open the door, and stood in the doorway, staring at the empty crib. Alexander's blanket still lay where Isabella had left it, and Ethan picked it up, brought it to his face, and inhaled the scent of his son. And then, for the first time since his mother's funeral, Ethan Blackwell broke. He sank to the floor, clutching the blanket, and the sobs that tore from his chest sounded like a man dying, because in every way that mattered, he was. He had chosen his father's lies over Isabella's truth, his fear over her love, and now he was alone again, exactly as he deserved to be. But as he sat there in the empty nursery, surrounded by toys and memories and the ghost of the family he had just destroyed, one thought kept repeating in his mind like a death sentence. What if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life? And worse, what if it was already too late to fix it? 6 months had passed since Isabella walked out of Ethan's life, and in that time he had done exactly what he swore he would do. He had rebuilt his empire, closed billion-dollar deals, expanded into 3 new markets, and reclaimed his reputation as the most ruthless CEO in the city. The board praised him, competitors feared him, and his father had called once to say, with cold approval, "You finally remembered who you are." But every night, when Ethan returned to his mansion and the silence swallowed him whole, he understood with brutal clarity that he hadn't remembered who he was. He had forgotten who he could have been. The emptiness that had once been bearable, even comfortable, now felt like suffocation, and success tasted like ash in his mouth because there was no one to share it with, no child's laughter echoing through the halls, no woman who looked at him and saw beyond the armor to the broken man beneath. Ethan had tried to move forward, to convince himself that the ache in his chest was temporary, that time would erase Isabella and Alexander the way it had erased everything else he had lost. But some wounds don't heal, they just learn to bleed quieter. One evening, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself wandering into the nursery he had left untouched, a shrine to the family he had destroyed. He opened the closet and discovered a box he hadn't known existed, and inside were home videos Isabella had recorded on her phone, moments she had captured without him knowing. His hands trembled as he took the phone back to his study, poured himself a drink he wouldn't finish, and pressed play. The first video shattered him. It was Isabella, her face glowing with joy, holding Alexander who was maybe 2 months old, and she was singing softly to him while the baby stared up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Say hi to Daddy," she whispered to Alexander, turning the camera toward where Ethan sat reading in the background, unaware he was being filmed. "That's your daddy. He pretends he doesn't care, but I see him watching you when he thinks no one's looking. He loves you so much, even if he doesn't know how to say it yet." Ethan's throat constricted as he watched himself in that video, saw the small smile that had crossed his face when he thought no one was watching, and realized with devastating hindsight that he had been happy, genuinely, impossibly happy, and he had thrown it away. The next video was worse. It was the 3 of them on the couch, Ethan holding Alexander while Isabella filmed, and she asked, "What do you want to tell our son when he's older?" Ethan had looked directly into the camera, his expression soft in a way it never was anymore, and said that he saved me, that his mother saved me, that I spent my whole life believing I didn't deserve love, and they proved me wrong. Isabella's voice behind the camera had whispered, "We love you too," and the video ended. Ethan sat in the darkness, tears streaming down his face, and whispered to the empty room, "I'm so sorry." How did a man live with the knowledge that he had held paradise in his hands and chosen to let it slip through his fingers? How did he reconcile the person he had become with the person he could have been if he had just been brave enough to fight his demons instead of surrendering to them? The next day, Ethan drove to the orphanage, the place where Isabella had first seen his humanity, where he had confessed his wounds and allowed himself to be vulnerable. But when he arrived, his heart sank. The building was abandoned, windows broken, weeds overtaking the playground where children's laughter used to ring out. A sign on the fence read, "Condemned, scheduled for demolition." Ethan stood there staring at the ruins, and it felt like looking into a mirror. This was what happened when you stopped caring, when you let fear win, when you chose isolation over connection. Everything eventually crumbled into nothing. He had become this abandoned building, once full of life and purpose, now just a shell waiting to be erased. He sat on the same weathered bench where he had told Isabella about his mother, and for the first time in his adult life, Ethan allowed himself to truly grieve, not just for Isabella and Alexander, but for the boy he had been before his mother left, for the man he could have become if his father hadn't poisoned him with fear, for every moment of happiness he had rejected, because he was too terrified to believe it could last. He cried until he had no tears left, and when he finally stood, he felt lighter and heavier simultaneously. Lighter because the dam had finally broken, heavier because he understood the full weight of what he had lost. Ethan returned home to find Marcus, his oldest friend and the only person who had permission to speak truth to him, waiting in his study. "We need to talk," Marcus said, and the gravity in his voice made Ethan's blood run cold. "What is it?" Ethan asked, though part of him already knew, already felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "It's Isabella," Marcus said carefully, watching Ethan's face. "I thought you should know. She's leaving the country. She accepted a teaching position in Paris. She and Alexander are flying out tomorrow morning." The words hit Ethan like a bullet, and suddenly he couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the single, screaming realization that he was about to lose them forever. Not just physically lose them, not just have them living across town where he could see them if he swallowed his pride, but lose them permanently, irretrievably, across an ocean and a lifetime of choices that could never be unmade. "Tomorrow," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Tomorrow," Marcus confirmed. "Ethan, I don't know what happened between you two, but I've known you for 20 years, and I've never seen you as alive as you were when she was in your life. Whatever your father told you, whatever fear is holding you back, is it really worth losing the only people who ever made you happy?" Ethan looked at his friend, at the concern in his eyes, and the answer came with painful clarity. No, nothing was worth this. Not his pride, not his fear, not his father's poisonous legacy. He had spent 6 months proving he could survive without Isabella and Alexander, but surviving wasn't living, and he was so tired of merely surviving. "Where is she?" Ethan asked, already moving toward the door. "Last I heard, she's staying at a hotel near the airport." "But Ethan," Marcus grabbed his arm, "if you're going to do this, if you're going to ask her to stay, you need to mean it. You can't just apologize and expect her to forgive you. You destroyed her. You have to be ready to prove you've changed, to fight for her the way you should have fought 6 months ago." "I know," Ethan said, and for the first time in half a year, there was certainty in his voice. "I'm going to get them back. I have to." He drove through the city like a man possessed, traffic and red lights meaningless obstacles, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. What if she refused to see him? What if she had already moved on, built a new life where he was nothing but a painful memory? What if he had waited too long and the damage was irreparable? But even if she rejected him, even if she told him to go to hell and slammed the door in his face, he had to try. He had to tell her the truth he should have said 6 months ago, that she wasn't a deal. She was his salvation. And losing her had taught him that all his father's warnings about love destroying empires were wrong. Love was the only thing that could build something worth having, and he had been a fool to walk away from it. As he pulled up to the hotel, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, Ethan Blackwell understood that the next hour would determine the rest of his life. He had one chance to make this right, one opportunity to prove he had learned what it meant to be brave, and if he failed, he would spend the rest of his existence knowing he had been given paradise twice and thrown it away both times. Isabella stood in the airport terminal with Alexander sleeping against her shoulder, her boarding pass clutched in her free hand, and felt the weight of every choice that had led her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had walked out of Ethan's mansion with her heart shattered and her dignity intact, and in the months since, she had rebuilt herself piece by painful piece. She had found an apartment, secured the teaching position in Paris, and learned to exist in a world where the man she loved had chosen fear over her. The grief had been unbearable at first, the kind that made breathing feel like labor, but gradually it had softened into something she could carry, not healed, but surviving. And now she was leaving, taking her son to a new country where Ethan Blackwell would be nothing but a ghost she occasionally thought about on quiet nights. This was her freedom, her fresh start, and she told herself the tears threatening to fall were tears of relief, not loss. But then she heard her name, shouted across the crowded terminal with desperate urgency, and her entire body went rigid with recognition. Isabella. She turned, and there he was, Ethan, running through the airport like a man chasing salvation, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his eyes wild with something that looked terrifyingly like hope. People stared as he pushed through the crowd, and Isabella's first instinct was to run, to grab Alexander and disappear through security, where he couldn't follow. But her feet wouldn't move, rooted to the ground by the part of her that had never stopped loving him, the part she had tried so hard to bury but couldn't kill. Ethan reached her breathless, his chest heaving, and for a long moment they just stared at each other across the space of 6 months and 1,000 unspoken words. He looked different, thinner, haunted, like a man who had been living in his own personal hell. And despite everything, despite the pain he had caused and the words he had said, Isabella's heart still ached at the sight of him. "Isabella," he said again, her name sounding like a prayer. "Please. I need to talk to you." "There's nothing left to say," Isabella replied, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "You made your choice 6 months ago, Ethan. You told me I was just a deal. You let me walk out of your life without fighting for us. What could you possibly say now that would change any of that?" "Everything," Ethan said, stepping closer, his voice raw with desperation. "I was wrong. About everything. I let my father's poison convince me that loving you was weakness, that caring meant losing control, and I pushed you away because I was terrified. But these past 6 months have been the most miserable of my entire life. I built my empire higher, closed bigger deals, proved to everyone that I was still the ruthless billionaire who needed nothing and no one. And every single day, I died a little more inside." Isabella felt tears burning in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay strong, to not let his pain erase her own. "You chose that death, Ethan. I begged you to fight for us, and you told me I was a lapse in judgment. Do you know what that did to me? Do you have any idea what it feels like to love someone with everything you have and watch them reduce that love to a business transaction?" "I know," Ethan said, and tears were streaming down his face now, this man who had spent a lifetime refusing to cry. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it. But Isabella, please listen to me. You were never the deal. You were the only truth I ever had. You walked into my life when I was barely alive, just going through the motions. And you made me feel things I had sworn I would never feel again. You made me laugh, made me hope, made me believe that maybe my father was wrong and love wasn't destruction. It was creation. And I was so happy with you and Alexander that it terrified me, because I didn't know how to protect something so precious. So I destroyed it myself before life could destroy it for me." Isabella closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her, and she wanted so badly to believe him, to fall into his arms and tell him everything would be okay. But love wasn't enough. It had never been enough. "You can't love someone only after you've destroyed them, Ethan," she said, opening her eyes to meet him, and the devastation in her voice was absolute. "You can't spend 6 months learning to appreciate what you had only after you've thrown it away. That's not love, that's regret. And I deserve more than being someone's regret." "You're not my regret," Ethan said desperately, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "You're my everything. You're the only person who ever saw me, really saw me, and didn't run. You're the mother of my child, the woman who taught me what it meant to be human, and I am begging you, Isabella, please don't get on that plane. Please give me another chance to prove that I can be the man you deserve from the beginning." Isabella looked down at Alexander, sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, oblivious to the fact that his parents were breaking each other's hearts in the middle of an airport terminal. She thought about what it would mean to stay, to give Ethan another chance, to risk her heart again on a man who had already shattered it once. And she thought about Paris, about the life waiting for her, where she wouldn't have to look at Ethan and remember everything she had lost. Could a woman really forgive the unforgivable? Could two broken people rebuild something that had been destroyed so completely? "I loved you," Isabella said softly, and the past tense hung between them like a death sentence. "I loved you more than I thought it was possible to love someone. But love isn't enough when the person you love doesn't believe in it. You taught me that, Ethan. You taught me that I can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and I can't stay in a relationship where I'm always wondering when you'll run again." "I won't run," Ethan pleaded, his voice breaking. "I swear to you, I will never run again. I will spend every day proving that you can trust me, that I've changed, that I understand what I lost, and I will never make that mistake again." Isabella shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. The mistake was already made, Ethan. And some mistakes can't be fixed, no matter how sorry you are. She adjusted Alexander on her shoulder, preparing to walk away, and Ethan felt his world ending in real time. I hope you find peace, she whispered. I hope you learn to love yourself the way you could never quite love me. And I hope someday you understand that letting me go isn't protecting yourself. It's just another way of running. Isabella, please, Ethan said one last time, his voice barely audible. But she was already walking away, heading toward security. And he stood frozen, watching the only woman he had ever loved disappear from his life for the second and final time. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she would see him breaking, and part of her would want to fix him, to be the one who saved him from himself. But Isabella had learned the hardest lesson love could teach. You couldn't save someone at the expense of saving yourself. So she walked through security with her head high and her heart in pieces, got on the plane with Alexander, and as it lifted off the runway, carrying them toward their new life, she let herself cry for the man she loved and the family that could have been. Ethan stood at the glass windows watching the planes take off, not knowing which one carried her, but watching them all anyway, and he felt something inside him die permanently. He had been given a second chance, had run to her with his heart in his hands, and she had been right to refuse him. He didn't deserve her forgiveness. He didn't deserve another opportunity to hurt her. All he deserved was this, the emptiness, the regret, the knowledge that he had held paradise and thrown it away not once but twice. He drove home in silence, walked through his mansion that felt more like a tomb than ever, and found himself standing in the nursery again. Alexander's blanket still lay in the crib where Ethan had left it months ago, and he picked it up, brought it to his face, and inhaled the fading scent of his son. Then he sank into the rocking chair by the window, clutching the blanket against his chest, and whispered into the empty room, Isabella. The name was a confession, a prayer, an apology that would never be heard. And as Ethan Blackwell sat in the darkness of his son's empty room, surrounded by toys that would never be played with and memories that would haunt him forever, he finally understood the full price of his choices. He had his empire, his wealth, his father's approval, and absolutely nothing that mattered. He had won every battle except the one that would have given his life meaning, and now he would spend the rest of his existence knowing exactly what he had lost and exactly how much it cost. Some love stories end with triumph, some end with reunion, and some end with the devastating truth that love arrived too late, that second chances were squandered, and that the greatest tragedy wasn't never finding love, it was finding it, destroying it, and having to live forever with the ghost of what could have been. Ethan whispered her name again into the darkness, and the darkness whispered nothing back. Thank you, my beautiful family, for watching till the end. Your time means the world to me, and every like, comment, and share helps this family grow stronger. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful love story here on my channel. Remember, true love always finds its way back, sometimes when we least expect it.